Well, howdy, y'all, and welcome to the real backwaters, where the rods are always ready, the water runs deep, and the stories run even deeper. With your host, Daniel Woodcock, bringing you right into the heart of the Southeast, one cast at a time. Now, whether you're drifting down a lazy river in your yak, hunkered down in a John boat, or just dreaming about your next big catch from the comfort of your porch swing, this here's the place for you. We talk fishing, backwaters, bait, and a whole lot of grit. So grab your gear, crack open a cold one, and settle in. You're listening to the real backwaters, where southern waters tell their tales. Let's get it rolling, y'all.
Hey, and welcome back to the Real Backwaters podcast. Man, what we're going to dive into today is old school plastic worms, bass fishing, timeless secrets, right? Man, these things we'll take you down the memory lane, back to them old tackle boxes. You know what I'm talking about. Those old school plastic worms that changed bass fishing forever, right? You know, before the chatterbaits, and the swim baits and all those fancy rigs we have today that everybody Google eyes over. There's only one lure that really kicked off the plastic revelation, right? I'm talking about the plastic worm. There's a history behind the plastic worm, and it started back in the 1940s. When it was first commercially sold by Nick Cream of the Cream Lure Company, and he developed what they call the scroungeler, or that if that's the word, scroungeler worm. And golly, let me tell you, when it hit the market, the bass fishing was never the same, right? When these plastic worms were developed, there wasn't a whole lot of fishermen that used plastics back in the day. They always used live bait and, crawlers, minnows, some small bait fish, maybe caught some small brim and used them, shiners, things like that. But when you create a lifelike worm, like Nick did back in the 1940s, you could really change the way that you fished, right? It was definitely what we call, quote, a game changer, quote, right? I think the word game changer has hit the market in the fishing industry real big as well, right? Because that's all they talk down at ICAST. Well, this is a great game changer. Well, this is a game changer. Well, I think if you go back and look at all the videos on YouTube about ICAST and just take you a pen and pencil and a piece of paper and count the many times somebody says a game changer in a video, it'll overwhelm you. So, as a kid growing up, I remember going to my dad's tackle box, my grandfather's tackle box, and seeing these old, these plastic worms just sitting in the little long trays. And I can remember back in the day was old man's jelly worm. That was my grandfather's favorite worm, and my dad even fished with them. They were black, some kind of orange or methylate tail, curly. Then you come out, they had the black grape. They eventually come out with the motor oil, and then they started coming out with the watermelon pumpkin seed series. But these things were big in the 1970s, 80s. If you wasn't throwing a 6-inch curly tail worm, you wasn't even fishing, right? And then, I can remember, like I said, my granddad just handed me a pack of them jelly worms. The tail's all bright red, methylate. They kind of had a little sweet smell to them. And he'd tell me, son, tie one of these on and just let it do the work, right? And he was right. Those things flat out caught fish back in the day. Heck, I even in my early teenage, late teenage, early adulthood days, I was still hunting for them old man worms. Some other companies that came about was culprit. Everybody had the red shad worm, the black. I think they had a color named copper or something like that. It was light brown on one side and black on the other. You can still find culprits inside some Walmarts. I hadn't even been in some Walmarts to look to see what they got now because of all this new stuff that's come out. But fishing old style is, with these what they call now the retro baits. I think retro is what we need to come back to fishing, right? Because you got swim bait costing over $100 a swim bait, then you got chatter baits up in the $20-$25 range. It's just crazy how the fishing industry has not upped the game, but kind of pursued things that other fishermen kind of fish with in other regions of the world. The United States, Japan has a hell of a market on fishing lures. But old school is sometimes the easiest and the most efficient, and I would say money wise to go back to, right? Because you can buy a pack of hooks, some sinkers. I'm not talking tungsten. I'm talking about just lead. And I understand that some states, not lakes, but waterways too, has actually outlawed lead to be used, just because of the carcinogen stuff they say that it's made with. But yeah, if you break down just the old school, the techniques still work today, right? Now, plastic worms still catch bass, and maybe better than all these modern lures. You using these worms on Texas rigs, Carolina rigs, just simple techniques. I was speaking on a podcast the other night, Kayak Cafe, where we were talking about some old ways that I still fish is a zoom trick worm. I fish it weightless, because in the rivers down here in southeast Georgia, that's the way I like to fish. Weightless trick worms, white, black, pink. You could probably throw a June bug color, but going back to old school, you could still throw curly tail worms. You could throw them weightless or Texas rig style weightless, or even take some Cinco's, stick baits, whatever you want to call them, and just use them. But it's the beauty of the worms, right? They teach us patience in the fishing world, and you can't rush a fish to bite, right? You just got to slow down. You got to wait for that tap, and then bam, set the hook, right? But these old school ways of fishing, I think need to come back. And I would like to see a lot more professional fishermen fishing a Texas rig or a weightless sink or weightless, stuff like that. You barely see anything on the MLFs or even the Bassmaster Elite stuff where they're fishing a Texas rig. You'll see them throwing Carolina rigs sometimes, but this the world has changed with the fishing industry, and I think the old school way is going by the wayside as far as the retro stuff. There's a YouTube channel out there called, I think, Retro Bassin or something like that. He goes around and hunts all these retro baits. But man, it's just, it brings back a lot of memories for me growing up, because as a kid you would dig through your dad's tackle box, right? And I think man jelly worms came in with a cardboard back, maybe had like 4 or 5 worms in there, with plastic kind of sealed. But you would pick them things up and going, do fish really bite these things? Because it's just to a point where we forget about the old school ways versus the modern day world days, right? If I'm looking down at my reels right here, they're right beside me. I've got a Texas rig tied on plastic. I've got a big 13-inch worm tied on in Texas rig style. Another plastic shaky head, and then I've got the Charlie Brewer slider worm head paired with it was poured by Tim Williams down in Florida. But I call it's a finesse speed worm. But can't really call it a speed worm because Zoom's got the patent on that. So, but yeah, these old school ways, I test to you and want to put you on a challenge just to leave all the spinner baits, the chatter baits, the big swim baits, jigs, things like that. Leave them at home. Go buy you a pack of these old jelly worms if you can find them, these culprit worms, and just go some old school style fishing. But man, all them days that I've fished with the old school plastic worm, I've pulled many a fish out of many a farm ponds when I was young. I even caught my best out of a kayak fishing a Texas rig, curly tail, zoom worm, and June bug. I've even got, two of my best fish have come off an old style fishing, the Texas rig with a curly tail worm. And both of them won me some big bass in some online tournaments that I fished. But yeah, it's an easy way and an efficient and cost efficient way to fish, because it just doesn't get any better than old school retro style. But yeah, it's just thinking about this is bringing back a lot of childhood memories of all the fish that I've caught using plastic worms, old school style, Texas, weightless, heck, wacky rigging before wacky rigging was even thing. So, but like I said, I want to challenge you as a listener, as a follower of the Real Backwaters. Time to reflect on your childhood. kind of leave us a comment on this podcast as well of what type of retro bait that you started out bass fishing as a child. If it was a certain type crankbait or a certain type spinner bait, just kind of let us know what you threw retro style, old school style as a kid growing up. What your dad, your grandpa taught you how to fish with, things like that. But it's just don't overlook the classic stuff. Dig out them old plastic worms, rig it up and see what happens. And maybe you'll hook into that monster that's been just laughing at you all these years, saying, look at there, he's throwing a chatterbait at me, and I ain't gonna eat that chatterbait. But yeah, it's a challenge. I'm challenging all my listeners, all my followers, to break out the old school stuff and go fishing. But hopefully this little short podcast will spark some memories, some fire under you to get out there and fish. I know it's hot. I know a lot of people are waiting for the cool fall weather to move in. I certainly am. I went fishing the other day and got out there about 5:30, and by 9:30 I was home because it started getting hot. The water temperatures down here in the upper 80s, lower 90s, so it's hard fishing. But take the challenge. Leave me a comment on this podcast, and let me know how your challenge went, what you fished with, what's your old school style way of fishing as a kid, and we'll get back with you. But as always, thanks for tuning into the Real Backwaters podcast. If you've enjoyed today's trip back in time, back to the retro style of way of fishing, share it with the show, share it with the fishing buddy. And as always, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And we just like to talk good old fish talk. So as always, stay safe on the water. Always wear your PFD and fish on.